I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next segment of our agenda, which is a panel discussion on exploring the intersection of AI governance frameworks and conflict transformation. So let me just bring up some of our speakers. I think I saw Rashad here, I saw Hilary, and I think Sam is here. If you could just turn your camera on so I can spotlight you, that would be wonderful. Hi, Rashad, good to see you.
Hey, Nick,
Hilary,
apologies, but I am in the midst of a move in the midst of a Georgia heat wave with limited bandwidth, so I'm going to be unfortunately off video today.
Don't worry. That's fine. I'm going to rename you. You have it says that you're also Hilary, but obviously I know that's not the case. So there we go. You might have used Hillary's link.
I should be so lucky.
Right? Yeah.
I have special powers.
Right.
And then you just want to unspotlight them all.
Yes. Okay, all right, thanks everybody. So this is going to be our last panel for today before we move on to the lunch break. So we have a bit of flexibility built into this, but this was a panel that I wanted to put into the agenda, which is kind of take stock and think about various global and regional AI governance frameworks that are out there. There's been a lot of stuff being produced at the UN, at the national level, within the private sector, and kind of look at how much these frameworks intersect with peace building and conflict prevention and conflict transformation. So we're going to explore that question and see what avenues exist to integrate peace building into the implementation of these frameworks. So we're going to have discussions or remarks from our panelists, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. But I wanted to first turn over to Rashad Abelson, who is the technology sector lead at the Center for Responsible Business Conduct at the OECD. And he is joining us from Paris, France at the end of his workday. So we are very grateful for his joining us. So Rashad, the OECD was kind of the leader when it came to this, right? The AI principles that the OECD released were originally adopted in 2019, and then you updated it in 2024. But these are principles that aim to promote the use of AI that's innovative, it's trustworthy, respects human rights and democratic values. So I would love if you could share a bit about the origins of the principles and how they have sought to stand the test of time as the AI conversation quickly evolves over recent years.
Happy to answer that. So just to start with answering your question, I'd like to do like a little bit of a small intro about the OECD, just because I think it helps put things into context. So one of our overarching objectives across all of our work, not just AI, is to support policy coherence and coordination among all of our member governments. We have 38 member governments. We have a few other governments that are non-members that participate in certain committees. For example, our committee that works on AI has, I think, 44 members. And then the way we support policy coherence and coordination is through the development of these consensus-driven government-backed instruments, like the OECD recommendation on AI, which is known kind of more popularly as the OECD AI principles. And then those instruments are then operationalized and monitored. So in the area of responsible AI, we have two key instruments, the AI principles, which sets out these values-based principles. They're directed at governments and actors in the AI system lifecycle. Those principles cover, like you said, issues around transparency, explainability, robustness, security, human-centered values, and democratic governance, among other issues. The OECD recommendation on AI, the AI principles also set out a common definition of AI systems that have since been adopted into various kind of hard law and soft law, for example, the EU AI Act, as well as a number of other voluntary frameworks like the US risk management framework for AI from the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Those principles were deliberately designed to be technology agnostic and values-based rather than prescriptive. And that's really how we got around kind of the timeliness issue of it, and we're able to keep up with various innovations related to emerging technology. So the principles, the 2024 update reinforced their relevance by emphasizing the adaptability to emerging AI developments, strengthening the focus on human agency and oversight, maintaining some of the core values while allowing for implementation flexibility across various national contexts. That's kind of how we deal with the fact that we have members who have very different approaches to this policy area. The US, Canada, UK, other Anglophone members really going for more of a voluntary approach to AI risk management, while other members, like mostly in the EU, but also Korea, for example, taking more of a regulatory approach. And then finally, yeah, we focus on fundamental human rights, democratic values, rather than specific technical specifications that can quickly become outdated. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Rashad, for that background. You talked about the values-based principles that or value-based approach that the principles take. So you have inclusive growth, you have human rights, focus on kind of an AI enabling ecosystem that's inclusive. So in your experience, what have been the entry points for the principles to kind of maybe promote or advance conflict prevention or peace building in particular? I think the peace building field, a challenge that we see is, the P, for example, in the HTTP nexus can often be forgotten conversations. It's hard to integrate into other sectors. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on, what are the main entry points where there can be that kind of prevention-oriented conflict sensitivity thinking with the principles?
So the principles actually reference a separate OECD instrument that I think would be even more relevant in the circumstance. They kind of cross-reference each other, and it's another instrument that I think is important to introduce. And it's the instrument that I work primarily on. Actually, it's what are called the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct. These guidelines basically set out government-backed expectations on how businesses can behave in a way that respects human rights, labor rights, governance, the environment. The guidelines are complementary with the AI principles. They supplement them, and they kind of cross-reference each other. And they apply to all companies, not only companies that develop AI, but also companies that invest in AI, provide hardware and data resources for the development of AI, and companies that use AI systems in their operations and products and services. So they take kind of a whole value chain approach to AI. These guidelines were really instrumental as an instrument that the OECD used to address the impact of companies based in OECD jurisdictions that those companies might have in conflict settings. Actually, you might be familiar with the conflict minerals policy area. You have regulations in the US and the EU that deal with conflict minerals. Those regulations were actually built on or heavily inspired from this OECD standard. The standard, kind of a specific characteristic about the standard that I think it's important to highlight, and that really gets to your question, is that the goal of responsible business conduct as a policy area is not to prevent companies from doing business, but rather to promote increased responsible investment and trade, even in high-risk contexts. So it's a standard of improvement rather than a standard of perfection. It's about incremental positive change and improvement over time, continuing to engage with various stakeholders in the context where your business is operating, using your leverage to get positive improvement over time, and to address kind of these broader governance area issues that might be present in the jurisdiction in which you're operating. So this is really essential, I think, for emerging technology like AI, because it allows for innovation to flourish, but in a way that's accountable and transparent.
Well, thank you so much. So kind of going on that vein, I would guess, can you maybe share any key successes, maybe particular context, particular issues, interventions where this was very successful at promoting that? And I like your thinking on improvement over perfection, right? I think that's a big principle of good conflict sensitivity and good conflict integration. And I would also say, do you have any thoughts on what are the greatest challenges in trying to promote those principles as well? So would love to maybe hear some examples.
Yeah, I mean, over the last few years, I think one of the greatest successes of the AI principles and the OECD guidelines has been their integration into various hard law and soft law instruments across our jurisdictions. Obviously, the OECD, our standards have to take a step back. We're a few degrees removed from the action. We recommend policy changes to governments, but we kind of let them take it from there and kind of monitor how it goes. But I think the integration of these common standards into instruments across our membership, so in the US, in Europe, in East Asia, Australia, New Zealand as well, we've seen kind of this reference and this kind of consistency. And that consistency is really important for promoting these standards globally and for pushing, like I said, this leverage issue is really important. So having multiple leverage points across the supply chain, all take up the standard and all implement the standard really helps drive its implementation further and kind of push to actually addressing these issues. I think it's a little bit too early to say, other than kind of this broad adoption, what success stories we have. A lot of the adoption, a lot of these standards are new, and we still haven't seen them kind of the teeth behind these standards really take shape, at least in the AI context. We've seen it in other contexts, and there has been a lot of success, but in the AI context, I think it's still a bit early. But I can point to kind of challenges that we've encountered in other contexts. So, I mean, this standard has been around for over a decade in the minerals context and in electronics and vehicle supply chains, where we've seen companies use this standard when engaging in conflict settings, for example, in Central Africa, when sourcing the materials needed for manufacturing batteries. We've seen companies kind of uptake the standard, drive other companies in their supply chain to take up the standard, and then even mine sites in Central Africa end up taking up the standard and implementing it, and we've seen reductions in issues like child labor and conflict finance and other issues where those mine sites have taken up the standard and are then selling their products further down the value chain. Like I said, it's still a bit too early. We haven't seen this kind of push and pull yet, and implementation, broad level implementation yet in AI value chains, but I think we'll have some learnings over the next few years and then adjust accordingly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rashad. I really appreciate that. We'll come back to you, don't worry, during the discussion segment. I know you might have to drop early given your location. So
yeah, I'm really sorry. It's not because I'm in
Yeah.
France and I want to leave work early. It's because I have to pick up a child from daycare in like 5-10 minutes. So I have to run. I'm really sorry. I can't stick around.
That's very important. Don't worry. Thank you so much for joining us, Rashad. We appreciate it. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll be in touch.
All right, thank you.
So I want to turn over to Hilary, and Hilary is the program lead at the Global Network Initiative, which is a network structure similar to AFP. And they do lots of very important convening work on the application of digital technologies, really focusing on kind of this interaction of government and companies when it comes to freedom of expression and issues of privacy. So I would love, Hilary, if you could maybe provide a brief overview of this landscape, when it looks like, especially when it comes to artificial intelligence and its connection to conflict risks around the world.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thanks, Rashad. That was a really great overview and presentation. So thank you for that. And thanks very much for having me. Happy to be here. So yeah, I will do a similar thing to Rashad and just give a little bit of background about what GNI is and kind of our approach. And then I'll talk a little bit about our kind of AI work and give some background. So as you said, GNI is a network. We're a nonprofit. We're a multi-stakeholder organization. We have over 100 members globally from across 4 sectors: the tech industry, civil society, investors, and academia. And our tech industry members range from companies that have social media platforms to search engines, to AI technology, to telcos, to equipment providers. So quite a large range of companies. And broadly, GNI sets a standard for how tech companies should respect the freedom of expression and privacy rights of their users, particularly when addressing government demands and overly broad restrictions that could have impacts on freedom of expression and privacy. And so we've been around for about a decade and a half, and over that time, we've worked to set principles and a framework for responsible business conduct in our sector, which are based on international human rights principles. So that includes the OECD guidelines that Rashad was talking about, as well as the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And our work also includes an independent assessment that our membership does for our member companies on the steps they've taken to protect freedom of expression and privacy. And similarly to what Rashad laid out, we use a standard of improvement over time. So similar kind of approach there. And in terms of our AI work over the last couple of years, we've kind of widened our focus to look at how emerging AI technologies impact existing networks and services and new products that are being created. Generally, GNI kind of believes that AI technologies should be understood as building on and influencing existing socio-technological and informational systems. So we don't necessarily need to create new epistemological paradigms to understand the impacts and to design effective governance. And our approach is similar to what Rashad laid out from the OECD, is to apply the lens of human rights to these emerging technologies. So we aren't specifically focused on the intersection of AI and peace building, but our work is relevant in that context, I think. So kind of similar to what Rashad was saying there as well. And some of our members are doing more specific work at the intersection of AI and peace building. So Search for Common Ground, thank you for inviting us, is a member. Heartland Initiative, Sam's on the call, is also a member. So there's members in our network who are doing kind of more directly specific work there. But so to lay out a little bit about kind of the work we are doing that's relevant here. So my colleagues have been working with GNI members and outside partners, which include the UN and the OECD, to develop and inform guidance on AI governance that kind of builds on those existing business and human rights frameworks and is informed by multi-stakeholder expertise. And we think that piece is really important. So having civil society at the table, having a wide range of stakeholders at the table. So that's looked like working with the UN BTEC project. We have a kind of foundational paper on responsible generative AI. I'll put that in the chat. And informing some of the OECD expert working groups work. And we also, through our convenings, we're bringing together really diverse practitioners and experts. So we've talked about kind of the practical application of human rights assessment methodologies in the context of AI technologies. And I think that intersects with peace building and conflict prevention, thinking about in specific contexts, what does human rights due diligence for AI technologies, like what might that look like, and what should it look like? What are the responsibilities there? We've also looked at kind of the role of government in procuring and using and regulating AI technologies. And we recently have a new working group that we're leading for our members. And as part of that, kind of the scene setting for that group, we brought our members together with outside partners, including Rashad. So thank you, Rashad, for your expertise, to kind of give an overview of global landscape of AI governance. And that included the work of the OECD and GPI that Rashad was speaking about, as well as the Global Dialogue on AI Governance and the UN Independent International Scientific Panel on AI. We've looked at the Council of Europe's Framework Convention on AI and Human Rights and Democracy and Rule of Law. And then there's also been some major convenings that people are aware of. The Africa AI Summit, and there's an upcoming AI Action Summit, which will be in India. And yeah, so kind of looking at those frameworks. And I would say generally, those frameworks are kind of broadly focused on mitigating risks and protecting rights and enhancing societal benefits. There's not as much focus explicitly on peace building and conflict contexts, but as Rashad said, those intersect where human rights frameworks are quite relevant in those contexts. So yeah, I would say I'm excited to hear the conversation and looking forward to hear from Sam as well.
Also, yeah.
Yes, Lena, to your point, I think in chat, those frameworks are broad. And so I think there could be more work on thinking about kind of what's the specific intersection. So maybe we're identifying a gap.
Right. And I was going to ask a follow-up question for you, Hilary, on, I think GNI comes with a strong human rights angle, right? Especially like AI and human rights and setting expectations for maybe the tech companies who are members of GNI, right? So I was interested by your example of human rights assessment methodology. I don't know if you could share more on that example, what that looked like, if there were certain contexts, like how that methodology was developed. That seems like a perfect example of like the convening power of you bring civil society in and they can share their perspective. So if you have any more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I can talk more about this, and then Sam might have some other thoughts as well.
Yes.
Yeah, and so broadly, we encourage companies to conduct human rights due diligence, which is a set of practices where companies can kind of assess how their products and services and operations more generally might impact their users and other stakeholders, right? So that can be both negative impacts or positive impacts. And then thinking about what mitigations they might put into place to either like try and reduce the negative impacts or improve the positive impacts, basically. And that process should include stakeholder consultation, so talking to civil society. So in context in relation to conflict, obviously that can be very complicated and difficult because it's hard to be able to talk to directly affected stakeholders, but talking to civil society organizations, talking to groups that have expertise in conflict and in peace building. Yeah, I think that's those practices have been developed over time and are being used in other parts of the tech sector, and I think are being used by AI companies, but as Rashad was saying, it's early. So I think there's a lot of room to kind of learn from what's already been happening across the industry and pick up. And there's also a lot of improvement that could still happen across the industry. So it's not like those are perfect. No one would say those are perfect practices as happening now, but there's a lot to work with that already is in practice.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you so much, Hilary. We'll return to you during the Q&A segment. So I want to turn it over to Sam Jones, who'll be a disembodied voice when he's speaking. His camera will be on. But Sam, and Sam was connected to me through Hilary as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing your remarks. But your organization does work that has a strong focus on the links between institutional investors and civil society, especially when you seek to promote risk prevention and mitigation around AI technology. So I would love, Sam, could you maybe give a brief overview of how is AI being developed or applied in armed conflict, right? And what is the state of the guardrails that are surrounding its use in those types of situations?
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and apologies again for the disembodied voice. I feel like I sound like a tech overlord with a Southern accent. So look, to the first part of that question, we could spend the rest of the day on it. Simply put, the ways in which AI is being developed and applied in armed conflict are increasing and changing with each new conflict and in the periods in between. And civil society and media reporting from Gaza about Israel's Lavender and Gospel programs, from Ukraine about Russian cyber operations, and from Nagorno-Karabakh about Azerbaijan's loitering munitions really underscore the escalating cost to civilians and their critical infrastructure. From where we sit, a few of the most pressing concerns related to military AI would be lethal autonomous weapon systems or laws, decision support systems, and targeting systems. So for those of you who aren't familiar, laws refers to weapons that can independently identify, engage, and destroy a target without manual human control of the system. Decision support systems use AI to process large amounts of data and assisting military personnel to decide whether or not to deploy lethal force. And targeting systems, perhaps self-explanatory, use AI to identify targets based on a range of presumably related data. And a critical issue within this space is the degree to which international humanitarian law, or laws of war, can be consistently, fully, and effectively programmed into these systems for the protection of civilians, namely the principles of distinction, proportionality, and necessity. Relatedly, there's also significant concern about the absence of what is commonly referred to as meaningful human control and the ways in which it compromises accountability in the use of these systems, which is clearly an issue when it comes to the development and enforcement of relevant laws. And around 2018, 2019, and connecting this to the investor space, the Council on Ethics for the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is the world's largest sovereign wealth fund of about 1.7 to 1.8 trillion dollars assets under management, called for lethal autonomous weapon systems to be excluded based on their fundamental incompatibility with international humanitarian law, both in terms of those principles of IHL and in terms of the lack of accountability. And then finally, with these systems, there's the rather obvious concern when used in conflict about the ethnic, gender, sociocultural, and other encoded biases that already plagues AI and the discriminatory application of law enforcement, healthcare, education, and other services. I'd say the second half of your question, the extent of the guardrails surrounding military AI's use, is much simpler. and that's that they barely exist. Or, perhaps more precisely, the proliferation of these technologies is rapidly outpacing policymakers, regulators, and legal experts, as reflected in the fact that there's no binding international treaty on the use of AI in military operations. And in fact, military applications of AI are conspicuously omitted from a range of ethical AI legislation, which I have to imagine is reflective of the potential profit of these technologies. For example, Palantir outperformed 3 of the big 5 defense contractors last year, and the power of the defense lobby, which is increasingly being blended with the tech industry and tech lobby. Notably, on a more positive note, of course, there was the February 2023 launch of the Political Declaration on the Responsible Military Use of AI and Autonomy, which was initiated by the U.S. Departments of State and Defense and is currently endorsed by 58 states. But again, that's a political declaration versus a legally binding treaty. And with all of that said, I think finally, it's important to point out and should be consistently reinforced, including amongst states, investors, and companies themselves, that international humanitarian law is applicable to all conduct in all armed conflict, and it absolutely applies to the use of AI.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sam, for that sobering but very candid overview. I guess, when I was learning more about the work that you do and your work with institutional investors, that really struck me. I think one, because as I said in my opening remarks today, the political and government landscape is so tough that us as peace builders are trying to look to different leverage points, different types of stakeholders to see where we can enact change. And that does mean tapping into the private sector and financial flows and capital. We actually just had a workshop 2 days ago here at AFP on kind of tapping into the private sector for building peace economies at scale. But I would love, Sam, if you could elaborate on the role of institutional investors, right, in shaping effective guardrails, governance frameworks around AI that can help promote conflict prevention or help set responsible standards and ethical behavior in fragile contexts or conflict-affected states. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, and by way of personal background, I mean, I spent 15 years prior to co-founding Heartland in the international development and human rights space, which of course relevant and related to the peace building space. And the reason that we really focused on institutional investors as potential agents of change is that they play a unique inside-outside role vis-a-vis companies engaged in any number of industries, but including military AI. And so on one hand, they're independent corporate entities with their own particular sets of values, priorities, and decision-making processes. And on the other hand, they're owners at varying levels of these companies. And so they have a legal and ethical obligation to act in the best interest of the company, or what's commonly referred to as their fiduciary duty. And, with the ascendancy of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG-aligned investing, which represents over $30 trillion globally, or $1 in $4 of professionally invested funds, they are increasingly defining that fiduciary duty to include both traditional financial performance as well as a company's impact on the environment and society, which is a concept known as double materiality. And as part of this evolution, they're engaging in active ownership, whereby they directly engage portfolio companies concerning a range of ESG issues, including, as of late, the use of AI during armed conflict, although that is a very early stage sort of development within the investment community. For example, these actions can include letters of inquiry about potential human rights risk. They can include company dialogues, shareholder resolutions, votes against the company's boards, public statements and collective action, et cetera, but all related to the ways in which a company may be causing, contributing to, or linked with human rights harms, escalations of conflict, and corresponding financial risk that materialize during, in these settings during the course of certain conflicts like Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, Myanmar, Ethiopia, and Syria. And just to give an example, one of our investment learning partners just filed a shareholder resolution with Alphabet or Google, which was voted on during the company's annual shareholders meeting this month. And the resolution focused on the ways in which the company's technology potentially contributed to harms and violations of international law in Gaza, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and along the US-Mexico border. And other partners are engaging in dialogues with Microsoft and Cisco systems. But essentially, investors are asking their portfolio companies to develop and implement policies, practices like heightened human rights due diligence, and governance measures that really address the misuse of military AI and other technologies during conflict or in the context of authoritarian and other high-risk settings. But it's important to point out, one of the primary challenges facing investors is that they have thousands of companies in their portfolios, right? Across different industries and with an array of E, S, and G risks. And engaging on these incredibly sophisticated and complex technologies like AI require a level of depth and understanding that they understandably don't possess. So a lot of Heartland's time is spent attempting, and I stress attempting, to translate civil society expertise like those gathered in the room today, virtual and in person, and reporting, and translate this into decision useful information for investors.
Right. Excellent. And that leads into my last question before we do Q&A. We're going to go over by just 5 minutes before we break for lunch, but how can, you do that work, you're kind of this broker between the civil society communities and the institutional investment communities who both bring their expertise. I think a common barrier we face as peace-building civil society is this inability to be in the room, right, when these decisions are made by these investors. So how do we build that connective tissue, and how do we create spaces where they can feed into that process earlier, right? So that there is a higher consideration of these risks.
Yeah, so building off the last answer, another major challenge facing investors is that they all use the same small universe of what are called ESG data providers. So firms like Morningstar Sustainalytics and MSCI. And these firms, in response to political pressure in the United States concerning Israel-Palestine, are really retreating from providing fit-for-purpose data, not just on that conflict, but across the human rights and conflict space. And this has unfortunately left investors, especially those in Europe that are legally required to report on human rights risk in their portfolios, struggling to identify and use detailed analysis on the ways in which companies are contributing to human rights harms and are in conflict. And there's also, and this is frankly a critical need that civil society organizations can help address. Now, an obstacle to this potential collaboration is that investors, and to your point, Nick, investors in civil society organizations often speak different languages, right, when it comes to addressing violations in armed conflict, whereas civil society has significant technical expertise and engages in long-form reporting on certain human rights issues and high-risk industries, value chains, and geographies. Investors can only absorb and use certain types of data and analysis. So, for example, they need to quickly be able to establish the link between the portfolio company and the harm taking place on the ground with a variety of key pieces of information, like in which conflict dyad is the company working, who is the rights violating actor or actors in the company's value chain, what national or international laws are being violated, how is this specific product or service being used to violate rights, and can this violation result in financially material impacts to the company and by association the shareholder. And this, again, is where we spend a lot of our time. And just to concretize kind of what this can look like in practice, Heartland partnered with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center and 6 digital rights global majority organizations to integrate civil society directly into investor-led company engagements around harms associated with targeted and mass surveillance. And so this effort includes a reporting template that was developed jointly between CSOs and investors that really assists civil society in providing targeted reporting in a way that responds to the unique needs of investors. And I'll drop a link to the template in the chat, and would really encourage any of the organizations present today to take a look, consider how it could be adapted to their own areas of expertise, and get in touch with us and the Resource Center to explore the work further. And just
Yes,
very
please.
quickly, I had mentioned the Alphabet shareholder resolution. Actually, the reporting template developed was critical in developing that shareholder resolution. It was directly informed by digital rights organizations on the ground.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yes, would love to have the links for those resources. I'm going to pause and see if there are any quick questions in the room. Chip?
Yeah, I'm afraid it's not a quick question.
Well, you're going to have to be quick. It's
Yeah,
almost lunch.
I'm
We're hungry. Yeah.
For both of you, and it's inspired in part by the previous panel. And because I'm sitting next to two women who have startups who are not using institutional investors. And the last panel talked about pro-social design. And I hear you two talking about trying to move major players. But what I didn't hear, and this is more for Sam because of the language he used, you talked about stakeholders, shareholders rather. There's a form of pro-social capitalism that is called stakeholder capitalism. The difference between the K and the R is 100%. And I'm wondering, this may be more for you, Hilary, are your members beginning to think about designing their businesses and other initiatives so that they're looking at all the stakeholders involved, not just the shareholders? It's a shitty question to ask just for lunch.
Hilary, do you want to go first, or go ahead?
Yeah, sure, I can speak to that. I mean, yeah, I think the practice of human rights due diligence is intentionally designed to think about impacts broadly, and it's specifically to look at risks to people, so not risks to the business itself. And that's so the practice of thinking about what a business's human rights risks should be thinking about who the user impacts to users, impacts to other possible stakeholders. So yes, I think the answer is yes. And there's a lot of work that's been done to kind of build out frameworks and tools to do that kind of human rights due diligence. Sam mentioned heightened human rights due diligence, which is basically like doing that kind of more intensively in specific high-risk contexts. And yeah. So Sam, I don't know if you have anything else that you would add to that.
I mean, just very quickly, I'd mentioned sort of the ESG data provider universe, and one of a long-standing deficiency in those methodologies was around, they looked at how the environment impacted the business, not how the business impacted the stakeholders. And as a number of investors have moved along the ESG trajectory, especially in Europe, Canada, Australia, and in the US, although with the current administration, there are obvious problems around that. They have started demanding more and more data around impact on stakeholders on the ground. Now, I'm saying this from more of a risk prevention and mitigation versus a positive investment perspective, but that is changing, and that's central to our methodology as we work with them, including trying to connect them directly with representatives of stakeholders in conflict-affected and high-risk areas.
Excellent. Well, I think we're going to call it there before we break for lunch. So thank you so much, Hilary and Sam.